The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents a conversation with Jenna Belk. So hey everybody, welcome. We've got another video as part of the Atheist Debates Project. There's some more that I'm going to be posting in the next day or so, along with the stuff for August. But I'm thrilled to be here today with the new co-host for the Atheist Experience, Jenna Belk. Some of you have probably already seen her. Welcome.
Thank you.
This
Really
was,
beautiful.
I had seen you around the ACA a bit, but I remember distinctly they pulled you in to do a nonprofits episode, and I was just walking through the building, and I didn't have to do a "Who is that?" because I knew who you were, but I was listening to the show, and I was like, she's way too good to not be on a show regularly because you managed to take charge of it, and it didn't stray, and it felt fluid. And then I was like, well, let's see if we can get her on the Atheist Experience. So how did you get involved with the atheist community of Austin in the first place?
Um, the Atheist Experience will be brought up in a minute, but it was part of my deconversion story. And so I found out when you had held up an ACA cup on one of the shows, and I hadn't really paid attention in the beginning. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're in Austin. So I really wanted to, first I just called in to say thank you so much because I felt like, my family would have been the kind of people to call and just berate y'all just because a show like that existed. And so I called to just show support. And Eric Murphy had answered, and he said, thank you so much. You just made my day. And I was like, they need help. They really do get calls like that all the time. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I need to go by and see if I can volunteer and see if I can help out at all. And so the first time that I pulled up, Eric Murphy was sitting outside and he was like, hey, welcome. And he just made me feel so at home. He was showing me the couch in the back and took me back into the production room, and right away they were like, we're about to put a show on and we need a call screener. You wanna help? And I was like, yeah. So the first day I was screening calls for, I forget which show I screened for the first time, but I wanted to get more involved. And when I'd said that I wanted to get more involved, the response that I got was perfect because it was like, oh yeah, okay. And I was like, oh yeah, these are skeptical people. They're not going to just believe me because I say it. I have to actually prove it to them that I want to be here and help. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to come up once a week and I'm going to figure out what day is good for me. So I was like, okay, Thursday is a good day. Do y'all need a call screener for secular sexuality? And they're like, yeah. So I just started screening calls, and then after a couple months of doing that, we needed a guest host, and they're like, you want to come in secular sexuality? So I was on a couple of those shows, and then the nonprofits day, I was supposed to be on secular sexuality the next day, but this day I was just hanging out at the ACA, and Jamie was working on something, and he was supposed to be on, and he was like, hey, do you want to fill in for me? And I was like, I don't know if I should, but if you need the help, sure. And so I did, and I had a blast and got to talk about different things on this different kind of show.
Sure.
And show a little bit more of my colors. And so you caught that, and just, I don't know, it just kind of escalated from there.
It was a good dynamic, especially since I had done nonprofits for years, and for a period of time, it was just me and Dennis Lubay in my tiny little apartment. Like literally, here's the bed, here's the sofa. We put a table in front of the sofa. My computer desk is here. There's about 3 feet of space to walk around, and we would just set the mics up and go. And it was a lot of fun. Now the response that you got when you volunteered may not have been so much about, oh, these people are skeptics, so much as in the many years that we've been doing this, there are tons of people who show up and are like, oh, I want to volunteer and help out. And some of them are there for, one day.
Right.
The other thing is, when we announced that we were looking for new co-hosts, and even before we had announced, there are always people asking, hey, how can I get to be on the Atheist Experience? And we'll get emails and be like, here's my credentials, I've done this sort of stuff, I've done this online, or I've got this. And the answer has always been the same, which is, this has largely been a close-knit group. First of all, you should probably be in the Austin area. I don't think we have that much. Well, we will have remote guests on from time to time. I don't know that a remote host is actually a good idea, given the way the production studio runs. So what we were looking for is people who are in Austin. We need people who have, obviously similar shared views and mission, but slightly different perspectives on things, because at no point would we ever need a show where there's like 4 of me or 4 of you, right, or anything else. Getting the point. Even yesterday there was something on the show where you thought you might disagree with me, and then as you were saying it, I was like, well, No, I kind of agree with you. It's just in this one situation, I'm not sure whether or not I would lie to my
Right.
grandmother type thing, because I'd always prefer to be honest. But seeing people show up and they, like, how can I get involved? Well, that's it. Show up. The building's open 7 days a week. There's things going on. Hang out and participate and get to know people, because one of the things I will never, like, I'll do a show with almost anybody, unless, there's some compelling reason not to. But nobody's going to be a co-host on the Atheist Experience until myself and the other people involved with the show know them and are comfortable with
Right.
them. And the only way that can really happen is for you to be in the area and hanging out and participating. And I look back to how I got started with this. And that was, I was writing things for a website. Somebody said, hey, have you seen this show? I said, no. Turns out Jeff D lived in the same apartment complex that I did, but I didn't know it. And he put a flyer up by the mailbox for the Atheist Experience.
Oh, wow.
And I went out to check my mail on a Sunday and saw the flyer, and I watched the show. I called in. They invited me to the after show dinner. I figured, what the hell? I went to the dinner. The next week I was in the studio, kind of observing and helping out a little bit. And I know at some point they had me doing the CG overlay graphics, and then I was screening calls, and then I was running cameras. And once I got, did all the little parts behind the scenes, and I was there every week, so I called in December. It was in March. I was standing there, and Jeff D was supposed to co-host with Ashley, and Jeff forgot.
Oh.
And Ashley and I are standing out in front of the public access studio, which is where we used to shoot it. And I had just written a big article on the Supreme Court's Ten Commandments monument thing. And Ashley just looked at me and he goes, I don't think Jeff's going to show up. You want to fill in? We need a co-host. And I was like, yes. And so, yeah, it was basically get a fill in, and somebody sees that you're good at it and like doing it. And plus there was, from the day I did that first show, it has always felt like an addiction.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm traveling, don't get me wrong, I love doing that. I love doing the magic shows. I love doing debates and lectures and everything else. But if I'm traveling and a Sunday comes up and I'm not on the show, I'm like, oh, I kind of miss the show a little bit. So you got involved, which, by the way, anybody's welcome to do this, and people can come down to the building, and participate in things. And if you feel like volunteering, we will happily, rope you into doing volunteer stuff. There's plenty to do. But I wanted to get back to your thing. So, but you had called in, and I guess talked to Eric. So you might have called in during Talk Heathen or something.
I think it was just downtime. I think
Oh, it was
there
just
was
an
no
off day?
show.
You
That
just
he just
called?
randomly picked up the phone, and he had remembered later, and he's like, yeah, because he answered the phone, and he had put on like this radio voice, and I didn't know how, I thought it was a recording, and I just kind of went, hi, and he was like, oh, hi, and I was like, I don't know, I just wanted to say thanks, and he was like, oh, thank you so much, and so we had this little conversation, and he remembered it later, and he was like, oh, I thought it was going to be somebody complaining about the show, and I was going to mess with you. And then it turned out
That's
to be
pretty
somebody
rare.
nice.
I sat up after I took over as president again. I was filling in the gaps, making sure the building was open on days when we didn't have an employee there. And normally the phone lines don't get answered. Like the number
Right.
that the number you would call the shows with isn't answered when we're not doing shows.
Right.
But I decided, rather than being in the main production studio office, because I knew other people were going to have to work, I would just turn the actual, where I sit every week for the show, I was just going to turn that into my office during the day. Because I could sit in there, have my laptop plugged in. The chair's not very comfortable, but, and then I would look down and the light on the phone would light up. And I was like, let's
Why
just
not?
see what happens. And so I answered about 4 phone calls one day. One of them was this really nice guy who, when I answered, he was like, oh, somebody actually answers this? And I was like, not usually, but today I happened to be sitting here, and I thought, why not? So we had this conversation about he's trying to start up an atheist community in his area. There were other people who were calling in to say thanks. There was somebody who was calling in to debate, and I had to let them know, hey, the show that you're trying to call is probably only on Sundays from 4:30 to 6. But so you've been at the ACA for a year and a half?
No, since December. Like
Really?
8 months.
You might be the. Okay, I have you beat in that I started in December and I was hosting in March. You started in December and you were hosting in June.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You beat me.
Yeah. but that's okay, because by the time that I got involved, I'd already been kind of an active atheist for a few years and writing things online.
Yeah.
And that's where our stories kind of depart, because not only was I primarily a Southern Baptist and, along those lines, you were Catholic. So tell us about your kind of religious background, and then we'll get into how you got from there to here.
Okay, so I was raised in a very small town. We had a 1A school, so there were 200 kids from K through 12.
Wow.
And
just to like give perspective, my high school graduating class in 1987 had over 900 seniors graduate. They split the school in half the next year into 2 schools. Each of those had more students than your entire K through 12 did.
So how many A's
By
was
double.
that? Like, did they grade it by A's?
I'd have no idea.
Because I know that 5A's, like Austin schools, are typically like a 5A, that many kids. But we were a 1A, so we were as small as it gets, almost. But anyway, it was a religious town. Most of the town were Lutheran, but we were outsiders because we were Catholic.
Shame on you.
So it was interesting being an outsider, being that much of a small separation of religion. But
And that is pretty tiny, and Lutherans don't tend to be, there's not much animosity coming from Lutherans and Methodists towards anybody else.
Well, but we stood out because I was one of 7 kids, and we were all really close in age. So it was like a smattering of us, and it was obvious, and we stood out, and we were different from everyone, and we didn't grow up in that town, and so we didn't have a street named after us, and it was just, we were the outsiders.
So the other 199 kids had streets named after them.
Basically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Welcome to small town USA.
So it was interesting. So they could basically control every person that we encountered in life. It was either people in this town or our family. And our family, most of my dad's side of my family lived in Austin, which was nearby. And so we would come to Austin, and the only exposure that I'd have to other people was my family. And my dad's side of my family is very, very, very Catholic. Mm-hmm. And he was one of 7 kids as well. And my mom was raised kind of loosely Christian, and she was one of 5 kids. So there's just a lot of people to entertain us and a lot of views flying around. And I never questioned Catholicism at all. But there were little things that I think back on. Like I remember we were going on a road trip when I was somewhere around, 9 or 10. And my brother just asked, if you were told the story of Jesus and you met a man today and he came up to you and started talking to you today like Jesus was and said that he could heal the sick and, could come back to life and all that, and would you believe him? And I was like, no. And then we just kind of shrugged it off.
I love that in the sense that I remember many times as a kid questioning certain things about Christianity. I have an uncle who, he's now retired, but at the time he was a medical doctor and a medical missionary. He was the most educated person in the family. He was generally viewed as the most spiritually wise person in the family. He's the one who helped lead my mom to Christ. He was, the good one. Mm-hmm. And I went to him a couple times as I got closer and closer to identifying as an atheist to ask certain questions. But I also remember, even when he wasn't around, he was kind of the touchstone that people would reference. And so when I had questions about Christianity, I don't remember, I was never like a nuisance in Sunday school or anything. I just kind of went along. Mm-hmm. But I remember when I'd have questions, I would ask, and the thing that strikes me the most is that whatever answer I got, I just went with it.
So did I.
It was,
we'll make it work.
Here's the preacher. He clearly knows more about this than I do.
Yeah.
And so if he says, that's not really something we can understand, we just have to trust that, God, who is much wiser than us, is able to see things that we don't and has a reason and purpose behind it.
That's one of the worst things.
It drives me bonkers now,
Yeah.
but at the time I was like, oh, okay. And I remember going to my uncle to talk about how I had a roommate who was an atheist and, how should I deal with that? And he's like, ask him where he gets his morals from, because without an ultimate, moral lawgiver, you can't have any sort of foundation for morality. And I remember at the time going, wow, that's brilliant. Why haven't I thought of it? You know?
Yeah.
And of course now it's not only not brilliant, it's absurd. And I stress this quite often. My IQ did not go up when I found my way out of religion. I don't care, by the way, I don't care about IQ. I know roughly where mine is, and I think IQ is a measure of how good you are at taking IQ tests. Because despite the fact that I have an incredibly high IQ, I've been incredibly boneheaded on occasion, and occasionally possibly close to brilliant on a couple of occasions, maybe twice in the last 20 years. But it's when the religious dogma gets its hooks in you to the point where it's a complete authoritarian structure, where God, you know, the man is the head of the house as Christ is the head of the church, and so there's God and Christ, and then there's your dad, and then your mom is a lower tier, even though she's really in charge.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
And it was kind of a weird thing to look at when I also look at the church. But you're in this tiny town, and you have basically your family. You're the lone Catholic renegades here, and you've got a father whose family is incredibly Catholic, and a mother that's, I guess, a little looser.
She converted before they got married, and his parents kind of adopted her. They were her godparents, and I think his dad was her sponsor, and so she got really close to his family. So basically, it became mostly his family that we interacted with.
But you're thinking about big questions, even at 9 or whatever, but much in the way that I did, you'd shrug them off. So in this small town, was there a Catholic church? And
no. So in a local town about 20 miles away, there was a church that we would drive the 20 miles every Sunday and go to that church. So I kind of grew up going to that church, and they had CCD classes on Wednesdays, and I would go to those classes. And
tell all the non-Catholics what CCD is.
Yes, but they had Bible study.
No, I mean now. Tell all the non-Catholics what CCD is.
So I don't know what CCD stood for. It was catechism something, but it was just religious classes where you could learn about the commandments, and you can learn for your, so you can do the sacraments, right?
It's basically Catholicism 101. This is your progress up to confirmation and.
Right. So there's this. I don't know how much anybody really knows about Catholicism, but the 7 sacraments are basically your steps for life. The things that you have to do. First, you have to get baptized. Then you have to take your communion. You have to get confirmed into the faith. And by the way, the age that they do that is like 14. It's like still kids.
Although I will say, I'd much rather hear about somebody being confirmed at 14 than what ended up happening kind of in my case, where at the age of 5 I walked down the aisle and I'm baptized the next week, and it was so young that my parents even asked the preacher, can this be real, and can he possibly understand this? And the preacher's like, well, you just have to kind of wait and see. And so they use that, or have used that, as a way of showing that I was never a believer.
Interesting.
That this incident that happened when I was 5 wasn't a real thing. The problem with that narrative on their part is that when I became a teenager, I immediately had this kind of this crisis of faith and dread, because I thought, from 5 to 13 or whatever I was, I'm saved. I walked down the aisle, I got baptized, and I've been in the church, and boom, 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 and this is all sincere. And then around 13, I started to actually understand far more about doctrine, both with regard to the Baptist church, and I thought, how could I possibly have understood this at 5? I couldn't have understood. There's no way I understood this at 5. And so I would get saved again, or rededicate my life, or whatever. And throughout my teen years, it was a cycle, which the church encourages, of, hey, we're going to go out, we're going to have fun, and we're going to do all this stuff, and you're living your life for Christ. And then as you go off and do the other things in your daily life through the week, when you get back the next week, it's, let's make you feel guilty for all those times that you failed to be a perfect, Christian. And so there's this guilt cycle that happens where you're constantly redoing it. You had to go 20 miles away to basically go to CCD and other stuff. But what was it like growing up, I don't know, Catholic, for lack of a better term, because while I have relatives who are Catholic, we don't often talk about that. And I'm an idiot when it comes to the only stuff I know about Catholicism are the things that I caution people about. Like, if you're talking to a Baptist, don't go arguing transubstantiation because that's a Catholic thing and not a Baptist thing.
Yeah, I mean, it really depended on who you talked to. You know, do you mean like what was it like being in that town with people who didn't necessarily agree with me, or do you mean what was it like being in that family unit?
I'm more interested in the religious training and what you thought about it and how you work that in your daily life.
So I just tried my entire life to just follow the rules, and I failed at that a lot. If you ask my parents, they'd say I was a bad kid. Because I was lying, I was very greedy, I was pinching and slapping. I mean, I was acting out a lot. And the things that I've learned now about child psychology, that should say something. But
where are you in the child order? Are you the youngest?
No. So there were 5 kids born within 7 years. I was the middle of those 5. And it goes boy, boy, girl, girl, girl. And I was the 3rd child. So I was the oldest girl, 3rd child. So the oldest girl has more responsibility than the 2nd boy, for sure.
Yeah.
But not quite as much as the oldest boy, right? So my oldest brother had a lot of responsibility, as much as my parents, almost.
Yeah.
And then I had a different responsibility, you know, but we were both, you have to be the example. You have to be the example. And anytime you do anything wrong, it's going to affect your siblings, and that's more on you.
Was it divided up kind of along gender, where you were the example for your sisters?
Yes.
And your older brother was, okay.
It was very gender separate. You know, my brothers were altar boys, and I wanted to play too. And they were like, no, you can't do that. Girls can't do that. And I was like, well, why? And they said, there's other things for girls to do. And I was like, oh, okay. So I just didn't do anything. And then, but my dad really stressed, like, he wanted us to be nuns, my sisters and I, and he really wanted my brothers to be priests. And I mean, to a point where I actually considered it around high school just to make him proud. And I mean, I never wanted that. I mean,
it makes me wonder how many, so I do have a problem with clergy in general, as I think there's a ton of problems with clergy in general, and I think the Catholic Church is probably one of the worst about this. People in my church thought I was going to be a preacher, and would say so. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, I did a debate just a couple of years ago here in Austin at Austin Baptist Church, and there was one of my best friend's parents and a former deacon from my church in St. Louis. All of them had flown down. They had heard about this debate. I hadn't heard from any of them in 30 some odd years. They showed up just to kind of, hey, what's going on? Here's this kid who we thought was going to be a preacher, and now he's up here debating whether or not the resurrection happened. Mm-hmm. And that deacon got up during the Q&A. It's out there on a video for people to watch, and he's like, you may not remember me, but we thought you were going to go on to great things, and what happened? And so there was a pressure, but it wasn't. I had Catholic friends who were far more pressured into going to the priesthood or becoming nuns than I was ever pressured. It was more like, we know what God wants for you. God wants you to do this, guy. And it was like a gentle push. And I remember one time sitting in the car with my parents, and I said, I want to be a disc jockey. And my mom said, nope, God's already told us what you're going to be. And my dad kind of patted her to get her to stop talking. Well, I'm not an idiot. If God told you what I'm going to be, and it's not a disc jockey, evidently God told you I'm going to be a preacher. So even though they weren't supposed to talk about it, it was kind of pushed that way. But you're being encouraged. Now, what do you think your dad's, and I realize that you can't really read minds, maybe you've had a conversation about it, but what do you think your dad's reasons were for wanting all of his kids in the clergy? Was it just a devotion to the church? Was it a
devotion to God?
Okay.
Absolutely. And he would tell us that over and over again. He would say, your mom and I almost joined the ministry together, but then she got pregnant. And then that was when we learned that this was our path, was to produce more servants for God. So your path is either to serve Jesus directly in the church, either as a nun or a priest, or to produce children and have a family and produce more servants. That's you. That's why we have you.
So now you're not a nun. Mm-mm. You don't have any kids. Mm-mm. Are these points of contention and conversation with your family?
So, so that
I mean, we
we'll
shifted
get
focus,
there.
but yeah, all right, keep going with the religious stuff.
So when I got into high school, my mom wanted to transfer us to that city that had our church. That was a
Right.
bigger city, to get us, because we were bullied in this town, and so she wanted to get us out of there, and so she did, and it was really good for us. And I actually got really involved with that church and the youth group there and the choir, and they had this conference in Austin actually called DCYC, Diocesan Catholic Youth Conference. And it's huge. I mean, thousands of kids rent out this huge hotel, and there's conferences, there's workshops, there's all kinds of classes and fun games, and they make it fun. And it was a blast, and I loved going and fundraising for it, and that's basically what the youth group did, was do fundraisers so that everybody could go to DCYC. And the thing is that I remember going to these conferences and just feeling awkward because it felt weird to be religious, you know? So many of my friends weren't, and it was weird. But after being there, we'd come off and we'd be like, oh my God, now I feel free and I can love Jesus and I can scream about it and I don't care if anybody judges me. And it was like, it was liberating.
This is Baptist Summer Camp
Yeah.
in Lake of the Ozarks, Camp Windermere, if it still exists, which my
Yeah.
dad went to as a youth and I went to as a youth. And it was, let's go down there, we'll go have fun, we'll get everybody on fire for Jesus and send
Yeah.
them back. Plus, we keep them out of trouble for part of the summer.
Right.
Yeah.
So I did that. I got pumped. And then my parents ended up moving us away. And I was so attached to this small town that I was like, oh, I'm not even going to school up here. I'm just going to work full time and do my class online that I have to do and move back home as soon as possible. And I did. And at that same time, conveniently met one of the adults in the youth group. He had a son, and met him and got involved into a relationship with him, which was perfect, right? I'm involved with this guy, and he's Catholic, and his dad's the youth director, and you know, my family's loving it, and everything's great. And it's so funny because we ended up breaking up. And so this is where my religion started kind of shaking, was because I started a relationship with him and I moved home, but I had gotten an apartment and I never stayed one night in that apartment. I spent every night at his house, but I was still a virgin. Okay, so I wasn't sleeping with him. I wasn't doing anything sinful. I was just spending the night.
Seems like you wasted that time, I would think.
Maybe. Well, but the thing is that his parents lived across the street, and they would notice that my car would still be there in the morning, and they'd be like, so what's going on? I'd be like, well, we're not having sex, if that's what you're asking. And they're like, well, people see your car there, and people assume things, and that's scandalous, and that's just as wrong. And I'm like, okay. So eventually I was like, okay, well, if they're going to think we're going to do it anyway, then fuck it. So
Literally.
that started, with endorphins and oxytocin. That started this intense roller coaster relationship. And I found out, well, I didn't actually find this out until much, much later, but I was codependent on him, and it wasn't a healthy relationship. And I didn't know the first thing about emotional intelligence. And I would blow up and throw temper tantrums, and I don't know, I was crazy. And so anyway, he ended up breaking up with me, and I moved in with my parents because, so I forgot, my dad had disowned me because I had moved in with him at some point. And anytime I would call him, the only thing he would say is, do you love Jesus? I say, yes, Dad, I love Jesus. Then why are you doing this? Okay, Dad, call you later.
Now, I had plenty of relatives who were Catholic. Actually, my mom's entire family was Catholic when she first met my dad, but they were partying Catholics. It was kind of, oh yeah, we're Catholic, but we're going to have this, drunken concert in our basement and sing dirty songs and all that other stuff. So it wasn't. There's a lot of different categories of Catholic, but growing up, I was always taught that Catholicism was a Mary worshiping, saint worshiping cult, and it wasn't true Christianity. And my Catholic relatives would often say, "Oh, we're not Christian, we're Catholic," despite the fact that it's all part of a same umbrella. But my view of Catholics were that if I did something wrong, something sinful, I had to recognize it, repent, ask for forgiveness. This was something that I did on my own, but it wasn't So like as a Baptist, it was more about orthodoxy, and Catholics were more about orthopraxy, which is orthodoxy would be right beliefs and Catholic would be like right practices. And so my Catholic friends would go out and party on Friday and Saturday because they could just go in the
Right.
confessional and say, oh, here's what I did, and I'll do a few Hail Marys and Our Fathers and whatever, and it's all better. It's almost transactional. And my view of that growing up was a little jealous because it seemed like none of my Catholic friends ever felt guilty the way I did. But I've learned since talking to them that it may have been more guilt-inducing because, oh yeah, I can go in and say this, but you don't get the satisfaction that you've actually made amends for those things. So you keep that baggage sitting around.
Well, there's that, but there's also, so the thing is that there are people that have married into my family that have told me, by the way, your family's not normal Catholic. My family, when I started learning about what religion really is in the process of my deconversion, and I looked up the definition of a cult, I was confused. I was like, I don't understand how this is any different.
Yeah.
Which I know a lot of Catholics who don't have that kind of experience. So it was very cultish, and in the sense of confession, I was told things like, you know, the confession, if you go to confession and confess something that you know you're going to do again, well, then you have another sin on top of that, and then you have to confess that too. So you have to go in and confess it when you absolutely do not intend to ever do it again, or it doesn't count, and then it's double worse.
Man, with that understanding, I don't think I could have ever walked into a confessional.
But you have to, because people judge you if you don't. And when the family goes to confession, you have to go to confession.
So confession is essentially just another lie that compounds your guilt already. Ouch.
Yeah. So I never liked confession. I didn't go very often.
One nice thing about, especially when Jenna and I are both doing Atheist Experience, is there are people who would, so I know Catholics and others who would say, oh, well, no wonder you're an atheist, you were a Baptist, you had the wrong religion. And similarly, there are people who are like, oh, no wonder she's an atheist, she was a Catholic, she had the wrong religion. And now with two of us sitting there, I mean, did we both have the wrong religions? And how do you know yours is right? So you went through this, and you got disowned by your father.
But he picked me right back up when we split up.
Course.
And I moved in with them, and they helped get me back on my feet. And so, honestly, Spirit 105.9 was a Christian radio station that really helped me get through a depressive time. It was very uplifting music. I still listen to it sometimes. I still have some of it on my phone. But
I won't hold it against you.
but I don't really listen to it very
and then
often now. But
I go back and listen to old Petra albums, which yes, that will date me. When I was active in the church in the mid to late 80s, it was Petra, who, by the way, brilliant musicians who wrote some amazing music. I just can't largely stand the lyrics anymore.
yeah,
But it was, then you would go to maybe the Pentecostal church to see the Carmen concert, because Carmen was, I don't know, the Pink Floyd of Christian rock kind of,
Right.
I guess, in show production. And that always bothered me too, because here we are Baptists, but we have to go to the Pentecostal church if we want to hear good music. You know?
yeah.
But, so you went through this. At some point, you started asking questions where you weren't necessarily satisfied with the answers.
So at this point, so this was a huge, the reason I bring up my virginity is because that was a huge thing for me. I was that girl in high school that I was never going to have sex till I got married. I was set on it. And so at this point, I was like, well, I learned that if I hadn't moved in with him or slept with him, then we would have gotten married and we would have had a really unhealthy relationship and never been able to get a divorce. And I was like, well, so I have to live with somebody before I'm going to marry them, regardless of what the church says. I have to do this for me.
Because it just makes sense.
It just makes sense, right? So
Otherwise
that means
you're
it's
getting trapped.
logical. So I'm sleeping around, I'm doing my own thing. And then I moved back to Austin again because almost my dad's entire family lives somewhere around Austin. So I was like, hey, I can go and hang out with them and get to know them better, see them on holidays and all that. So I moved back home. And I got involved with a church nearby and almost became a youth minister. This is where things started getting rocky. So I'm gung-ho, I'm going on these church camp groups with them and volunteering, and I'm really involved. And then I got a DWI. And I wrecked my car. So I lost my job. So I lost my apartment. And this church group was like, oh, you're not exactly going to set a good example for the kids. So, maybe come back later. I'm like, oh, okay, sure. So I go out and I do my own thing, and I find a job in a strip club and was exposed to different things and was exposed to the kind of family unit that I had never experienced before, because I was a full-fledged alcoholic and did not know it. I was coping with childhood trauma and did not know it. And I would go to work and I'd get drunk and I'd get trashed, somehow make it home and come back to work the next day and be freaked out and be like, do I still have a job? And I'd just be greeted with, you know what, you want to hear a funny story about when I fucked up? And I was validated and I was welcomed and I was forgiven, and I was always taken back so many times it's ridiculous. And then after a couple years of working there, I was like, I think I need some daylight, some. So I tried to get out of there. I started working in restaurants again and just getting myself out. And then I became spiritual but not religious.
Sure.
So I was talking to my grandma a lot, and she is kind of the matriarch of the family. She's the one you call if you've got a Bible question or a question about the catechism, something like that. And I was kind of talking to her through this kind of thing. And at one point so I got with my husband, and we were dating, and we were going to get married. And we were like, okay, so what are we going to do, right? Are we going to do it in a church, or are we going to do it with a pastor? What are we going to do? And I was like, well, I'm not doing it in a church, because to do it in a Catholic church, you have to do a year of Catholic classes, and I'm not doing that, and I'm not going to make you do that. So I'm not doing it that way. So we can find a minister. I'm still a Christian, whatever. And I was having a conversation with my grandma, and I said, don't worry, I'm still a Christian. She said, okay, well, as long as you believe in Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God, then you're good. And I remember just going, okay, just kind of stored that in the back of my mind. So then later on, we get married, and
Did you store it because it seemed to be a perspective you didn't expect coming from her, or?
Yeah,
okay.
Because I had been told by my grandpa a whole lot, you can't be a cafeteria Catholic. You can't just pick and choose, right. I believe this, but I don't believe that. You either take it all or you leave it all. And that's when I was like, okay, fine, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Christian. And then, so this was the time when I was kind of, didn't know what, and my grandma said, that's the thing that makes you a Christian. And I was like, oh, is that the thing? Then let me think about that. Do I believe that Jesus is the Son of God? I was like, oh, Son? I don't know. So I just kind of stored that for later. And so got married. So this is another thing, is I ended up getting married with a minister that my husband had been associated with. And none of my family, except for 2 people on my dad's side of my family, came. And they all found different excuses. Whether it was, oh, it's on a Friday. Or, well, you're already legally married, so why should I go to this? If you're already legally married, then why do you need to do it? Or, they all, every single one of them, found an excuse.
So there's a number of areas where our stories are similar. When Beth and I got married, we got married at a little place in Kyle, and it's kind of like a big barn type thing. It was an outdoor venue, and it's a really nice place. Originally it was like a dude ranch thing, but they weren't making any money, and they turned it into a wedding venue, and now they're booked all the damn time. And we found this place, and it was perfect, and we did it. We paid for everything ourselves. We sent out the invitations, and the thing it was kind of heartbreaking for me, because I know Beth had dealt with some issues with a good chunk of her family. Literally the only family members of hers who came to the wedding was her mom and dad. Nobody else from her family came. And I had quite a few people from my family, but it was mostly friends. And at the end of the day, we were kind of okay with it.
Yeah.
It's like, if you didn't want to come, but some of them actually lied. And I'm reluctant to accuse people of lying. To me, lying is an intentional act of dishonesty, and not just merely being wrong, or let me look at all the circumstances. Because when you say we didn't invite you, well, I guess it's possible that your invitation got lost in the mail, except that you've lived at the same address for 40 years, and you and everybody else in this is the mail person in Cleveland, Tennessee, just throwing away wedding
Right.
invitations. Doesn't make sense. So they just outright lied and said that they weren't invited. And it was a couple of years before things kind of got back to normal, or to something close to normal.
To be fair, most of them sent some kind of gift, so that was appreciated. But it was interesting because my mom wanted to be there, and she had been really battling this, and she had been talking to priests from El Paso, from Virginia. She had been talking to priests, any priest that she knew, and she would ask them, can I go? Can I go? If it's not a Catholic wedding. And she would get yes from some and no from others. And so she was like, well, I have to go. So she came. My dad agreed to cater an event. He wouldn't acknowledge that it was a wedding. He was like, I'll cater. And so he did, and I appreciate that. But when it came to taking pictures, when it came to a dance, when it came to anything else, he was not involved. And so that's just heartbreaking, So I was, I had been dealing with stuff like that for a while. It wasn't the first time, so it was fine. But, it ended up the people that did come made it amazing, and it was a blast. And his family is incredible. So they are atheists, but they don't really identify as atheists. They're just, be a good person.
Yeah.
Is what they say. And that's what they always said to me, and that's why I wasn't really turned off to them when I had met him, because I was a Catholic when I met him.
It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to pin down what portion of the population are atheists, are secular, or we've got different issues with the labels, but also we have different issues of what people are comfortable saying.
Right.
Because a lot of people view this as, hey, you believe, I don't believe, let's just ignore all
Right.
that and leave it at that.
And I get that, but I've just come from a situation where I have no choice but to care,
Yeah.
So it's like, I get that you don't care. That's totally fine.
I can appreciate, I think it's not so much that they don't necessarily care. It's that maybe they're avoiding confrontation,
Totally.
or whatever else. Let's try to keep the peace.
Right.
And that I can understand. But I'm also from a similar background where it's just I don't have the capacity to look at these issues as anything other than among the most important. Because if they're true, nothing could be more important. And
Right.
if they're not true, the fact that if they weren't true and we've bamboozled the overwhelming majority of people who've ever lived, that seems to me to be very important as well.
Right. And I'm with you, but at the same time, I'm like, I understand how it was because when I did believe, I remember being like, oh, this could not be true or whatever, but then just thinking, well, I've made it this far and I'm doing this well, so why rock the boat?
Yep.
And I get it.
There's a resistance to change. There's also, Pascal's wager, this notion of you might as well believe because what if you're wrong? I actually saw a great meme posted on Facebook the other day that I wish I'd come up with. And there's these two people talking, and one of them says, well, why don't you just go ahead and believe anyway in Jesus just in case you're wrong? And the other one says, for the same reason that you don't wear garlic necklaces to ward off vampires.
Right.
What if you're wrong about vampires? You could have saved yourself. Yeah.
Totally.
I wish I'd have come up with that. So now you're at a wedding.
Right. So now we're married and loosely Christian, and then I start identifying as spiritual but not religious. And I'm talking to some friends, and I'm like, so I find out that my husband's an alcoholic, and he goes to rehab. And then about, I think it was 6 months later, or a year and a half later, I found out I'm an alcoholic, and then I go to rehab. So he inspired me to go. I went, and that was a huge, huge turning point in my life, because so this is light bulb number one. I had gotten a PI, which was completely understandable and way late. But I went to the drunk tank and I was assigned to do community service and AA meetings because I couldn't pay the fine. I went to one AA meeting, and it was a women's meeting, and it was just, women sharing their experiences. And that's when I learned, oh my God, I'm an alcoholic. And that was huge, because this is when I started learning that I had the mindset of, I'm right until you prove me wrong. About
By the
anything.
way, we all have that.
Right. And it's human nature. I get it. But
It's
that
the
was
resistance
when
to change. I've come by my positions for really good reasons, and now you have to overcome those reasons before I'm going to change my mind. And there's no easy solution to that other than to encourage people. I mean, there's the quote from Bertrand Russell, which is, it's a wise thing every now and then to hang a question mark on things you've long taken for granted. And
Yeah.
that was when I read that, it was kind of eye-opening about, how many things did I just run with because they felt right, or because the people around me said they were right,
or because everyone I knew
yeah.
said that they were right.
And if it seems like you have a good reason,
Right.
well, then the people who don't agree with you, clearly they're just not as informed as you.
Exactly.
And then it turns out maybe you're the one who's not fully informed.
Right.
There's been a lot of that in the last couple of weeks, but I'm not going to derail into that because I want to get, I don't want to rush you. We can take as long as we
We're
take.
almost there.
I just want to get, because people need to realize this is still recent history for you.
We're now in 2016, August 2016.
Yeah.
So that's when I went to rehab. That's when I got sober. I had learned things in rehab that blew my mind, and they were just basic information about emotional intelligence that I had not learned in school, and I was angry that I had never heard this stuff before. It's like I know the entire story of Noah and Jonah, and I know all these little Bible stories, but I don't know the first thing about how to tell you how I'm feeling. If I were to look at a feelings chart, which they have in rehab, which is wonderful, I couldn't get past happy, mad, and sad. I couldn't tell you how I felt past those 3 emotions. And it's really important that you're able to identify what kind of emotions that you're feeling so that you can learn how to process them and how to handle them.
I might need this.
I think everybody needs this.
Because, so the other day, sorry, you're now all my therapists right now. Just because, so there's been a lot going on, and I've tried to maintain and think the best about people, but I realized I hit a point. I normally deal with stress pretty well. Supporters of this Atheist Debates Patreon project will tell you that I quite often get things posted on the last or nearly the last day of the month. I'm trying to do better about that, but it turns out that I actually work better on a deadline and that I generally handle stress pretty well. But a handful of things happened, and actually the biggest things, before anybody goes assuming, had to do with a personal relationship. And I realized I was sitting there with this, I didn't have the right words to describe it. Somebody was like, "Oh, are you suffering from anxiety?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I've never seriously dealt with anxiety." Well, there was we talked about yesterday on the show, there was certainly an 18-month period where I was clinically depressed and didn't know it, but my depression is not a chronic thing. It was situational. And
Which is still valid.
Yeah. And
it's still
but
depression.
when I feel what may be anxiety, it's situational, so I don't necessarily have the words for it. So when they asked me how I was feeling, I was like, it's just an overwhelming sense of existential dread, like everything was perfect a week ago and nothing will ever be good again. And they're like, yeah, that's depression and anxiety. And I'm like, oh, well, what do I do?
There's a number of things.
Yeah. And I have self-coping mechanisms that I came up with, like when I talked about where I won't stay in the house alone for more than 48 hours before I have to go be with somebody. And the good thing is that the atheist community of Austin's there. It's always open. There's people up there. But on occasion, because I'm surrounded by all this, I need to be around people that have absolutely nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
And turns out some of the avenues that I've used to find people to connect with outside of there have been really good in the short term and not so good in the long term. But it's a learning process. So you get to rehab and you've got a feeling chart and you're learning about emotional intelligence.
Yeah. So I get sober, and then I got sober, and the fact that I went to rehab lost me an opportunity for a promotion at the job that I was at a hotel, trying to get out of the service industry. And so I was like, well, fine, I'm going to go back to waiting tables because I made more money there anyway. So I went back to waiting tables, and doing that after having been a waitress for over 10 years, And being sober was it was overwhelming. And I stayed there for 6 months, and this restaurant was great to me. They were very patient with me, but I started having panic attacks in the middle of the dinner rush.
Did it have anything to do with serving drinks to people
Yes.
while you were... Okay.
Well, it had to do with serving alcohol and having to push alcohol in order to make any money, and then having to deal with drunk people, and having to then also the people that work there are all alcoholics. And if you don't go and drink with them after work, then you don't really fit in the group.
Right.
And so you're kind of an outsider. And so when you go to training, you have to taste drinks. And I had to label myself as an alcoholic starting off because I couldn't taste the drinks. And so everybody knew. And it's like, I mean, they were nice to me. They were fine. But I wasn't part of the family.
Right.
And so that, in addition to having panic attacks, I was like, okay, well, y'all have been really nice to me, but I can't keep doing this to you. I have to find another job. So I had a friend who I had worked with in the strip club that had gotten out of the club by applying to a temporary staffing agency. And so I did that. And within 2 weeks, they had me a job, and they had introduced it to me. They said, so it's really boring. I said, sold. Please give me something boring. And they're like, okay. And so they brought me in and hired me. And I then had a job that I could come in from 7 to 3, Monday through Friday. I had evenings off. I had weekends off. It was a sit-down desk job where I could listen to listen to audiobooks or YouTube shows or whatever I wanted to do while I was working, because it was just mindless, tedious stuff. And I loved it. And then, so my husband at this time was still working 80, 90-hour weeks at his job. So
That's murder.
I was bored. And all my friends were still drinking, and I had nothing to do. So I started having to find out what I wanted to do with my life, because I had all this time. And I was like, I don't even know what I want to do. So I started out watching movies, and then that led to wanting to learn more about the movies. And then that led to wanting to watch some documentaries. So I watched The Inexplicable Universe on Netflix that Neil deGrasse Tyson does, and he did so well just talking about science in a normal terms, that I was just sucked into it and fascinated by it. And he would say things like, oh yeah, we learned this 100 years ago. And I remember being like, we learned that 100 years ago and I've never heard of this? And I was like, what else don't I know? So then I started just trying to learn more science stuff. So at this point, now it's August 2017. What is 2019 now?
Yeah.
So this is August 2018 now.
So a year ago.
This is a year ago. I started trying to fill my time. I was like, okay, I'm wasting time, right? I'm not doing enough with my time, so I need to start educating myself. So I started listening to NPR on the way to work, and I was like, the Brett Kavanaugh stuff was going on, and I'm getting real political, and I'm like, honey, I think I'm going to be a political activist. I'm getting really into this stuff. I want to learn about politics and how it all works. And then I watched a documentary called Roe versus Wade on Netflix, and this was another light bulb moment. Somewhere in that documentary, there was a woman that said something. She said, when it comes down to it, if it's up to the government or if it's up to the woman, my answer will always be it should be up to the woman. And something in it clicked, and I was like, oh my God, it doesn't even matter what I think. The fact is that other people think different things.
Right.
And that's who it should be up to, right?
Because then it becomes, how do we live in a world where we don't agree on something?
Right. So I posted this thing on Facebook, and I was like, everybody knows I'm pro-life. Everybody knows I'm a Catholic, blah, blah, blah. I was like, I feel like I'm misrepresenting myself. I have to say something. So I made a post saying, like, I've been wrong all my life. I've been saying I've been pro-life, but now I realize that pro-choice is the only way because it's wrong to tell another person what to do with their body. And my family was... they were harsh. They were attacking me. It was vicious. And I tried to just hold my own and they kept asking me, well, what do you think? And I was like, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter. Well, when do you think life starts? No, the fact is that you can say it starts here and you can say it starts there, but is there even a right answer? And so...
Does it even matter when life starts?
Right.
What justification do you have to force someone to remain pregnant against their will?
Right. Well, so that's the thing, is for Catholics, it's about you're killing a baby.
Yes.
It doesn't matter where it is in the stage of life. The fact is it's a life,
Yep.
and you can't end a human life. And that's when I realized, I was like, okay, but it's always alive, whatever it is, if it's a zygote or if it's a sperm or whatever it is, it's always alive. So at what point is it okay to end it or not? And then I was like, but if it really is tissue, I mean, that's like menstruation. Like, that's not a sad thing. It just happens. So it just kind of got me thinking. I was talking to my little sister about it, and she was like, so wait, but when do you think a soul starts? Or do you even believe in a soul? And I go again, I was like, I don't know. Let me get back to you. And a couple weeks later, I called her back and said, nope. Don't believe in that either.
How'd she take that?
She goes, oh, okay.
Ah.
So, I mean, she doesn't know what to think. I think that she's kind of spiritual, but nobody else in my family will label themselves an atheist, except for my little brother. He came out because I did. But, okay, so the becoming pro-life, pro-choice was huge, because that was another time, a year later, that I was like, oh my God, I've been wrong. What else?
Not only that, it's not just I've changed my mind or I'm wrong. You're now in direct conflict with what everybody else in your life
Exactly.
or in your family believes.
And now everybody
And
wants to
what the
pull
church
me
believes.
back.
Yeah.
And so now they're directly asking me all these questions that I'd never thought about before. And so it took about a month or two of me asking more questions and talking to more people, because I was like, what else am I wrong about, y'all? What else am I wrong about?
It's funny that you say that. So you say all these other things that you had believed and found out you were wrong about. Mm-hmm. Can you go back a step further? If when you were, I don't know, at your most Catholic, if someone had asked you these questions or asked you if you'd ever thought about those, do you think you would have acknowledged then that, I really don't know that much about it? Or do you think you would have replied with confidence, oh, I've thought about these things and I love Jesus?
I would have had a prepared response.
Yeah.
There was a right answer. And that's the thing, is I didn't know how to use my brain before I started actually using my brain a year ago. And that's why there are people that I hadn't seen for a couple years that I met up with recently that are like, I don't know who this person is, but you're a different person. And I'm like, I understand that, because I actually am. And that's when you were like, I'm not more intelligent. I'm like, no, it's like you unlocked a different level of consciousness or something.
There
I don't know how to describe
I wasn't
it.
aware of. It reminds me the people who become Christians slightly later in life, who maybe weren't raised in it, but you hear about the people who went through a crisis, or maybe they were alcoholics and they credit God with delivering them from that, and it fundamentally changes their life, and they have this passion and drive that perhaps somebody who walked down the aisle at the age of 5, as I did, sorry for bumping my mic, don't really have. And then you watch the people like me who grew up in religion, and you, who find their way out, and all of a sudden it's very easy to put us in the same category as religious converts, because all of us have a passion for, holy crap, I believed this for a while, or I thought this way for a while, and now I realize how wrong I am. Let me share it to you. And I think the only difference is that I'm not making outgoing calls in the show or running around knocking on people's doors. I want to have the conversation with the people who want to.
But I think that's the huge difference, is that you're not recruiting.
Oh, no, I think it's significant, because on the one hand, I'd like to reach as many people as possible. It's just that I also have this foundational view of, you have every right to your belief, and I don't have a right to force you to pay attention to me or whatever else. And there are plenty of people who are willing to have the conversations, so I don't feel a need to go knocking on doors.
Yeah.
But it's, many times people, oh, you atheists are just as bad as the fundamentalists, as if there's, the people in the middle ground are looking at it. And I'm like, you're confusing passion for something
Right.
with like zealotry or dogma, because one of those is about dogma and the other one is the exact opposite of dogma. And it's like, if somebody was excited that that God had given them cancer, because you're supposed to rejoice and thank the Lord in all things. So when you get cancer, the people who look at that as a trial. And then the people who have their cancer cured, who are actively working on cancer research, those are not the same thing, no matter how passionate they are for it. It's two different things.
Yeah. So passion's been an interesting concept for me since actually deconverting. But so after becoming pro-choice and having these conversations with people and getting through all that, there was a point, so I was working at this office job and my office mate was a Muslim. And she was one of the sweetest people you'd ever known. Like, she was an amazing person. And I had been kind of sharing with her my things that I was learning about as I was learning them. And she kept looking at me like, you know, she'd cock her head and just kind of like, you're interesting. And then at one point I was like, you know, I think I want to try to figure out what religion I want to be. And she was like, oh, I want to take you to a mosque. And I was like, you know what? That actually sounds pretty cool. Like, I'm down. But before I start looking into this religion and that religion and that religion, let me try to figure out if I believe in a God first. And then I'll try to figure out which one feels more right to me, right?
I have to stare at the camera because it's like I'm listening to me at this point.
So
the joke that I used to use was that I realized it would take me more time than I would ever have to investigate all the religions. So I delved in on philosophy to kind of direct that search. And I used to joke that I started with Buddhism because I wanted to find out if I would have multiple lifetimes to answer this question.
Nice. Well, I had decided, so growing up, listening to my family talk, I mean, my family they're all Catholic. They're very educated. I mean, there's doctors, there's CEOs, there's really educated people. And so it was always fascinating just listening to them talk. And so I learned that the best way that I learn is hearing two people that completely disagree with each other talk, and then I form my opinion there. And that's what I've always done. So I decided to go on YouTube and just typed in atheist versus theist debates and wanted the most, you know, black and white, you know, give me both sides. And each one was like 2-3 hours long, and I was just like, I got all day. So I just plugged it in my headphones and it was working. And a couple days later, I remember I was listening to Christopher Hitchens, and Seth Andrews coined the term hitch slapped, I think. I got hitch slapped. I don't remember what he said. I think it was something along the lines of, you know, well, I believe in just one less God than you do. Something along the lines of that. And I remember just, oh my God, it's all bullshit. And it just light bulbed. And I just needed to do something. And I just kind of calmed down and I told my husband, and the thing is, before this, I had been looking it up, and I was like, so am I agnostic, or am I atheist, or what am I? And I had Googled atheist, and it said, you know, the belief that there are no gods. And I was like, oh, I don't know about that. I know there's something.
Yeah.
And so that's when I'd been spiritual but not religious. But then this point, I was like, oh my God, I'm actually an atheist, like for real. And I was like, this is the worst thing that I could possibly do in my parents' eyes. I mean, I could kill somebody, and this would be worse than that. And I was like, what am I going to do? And so I kept it to myself for a couple months. For like 1 month. And then at one point, I was like, I need to post something on Facebook. So I made some kind of meme in hopes of giving my family a little bit of time before Thanksgiving to get, you know, adjusted. And apparently, I mean, they still haven't adjusted. So 1 month was not enough time. But yeah, so that was my deconversion.
A decade might not be enough time. Yeah. And so since then, you know, obviously that was last October, and then you, as we talked about earlier, started getting involved with the ACA, but you've also had conversations with family members. I think probably, like, since we've been at this for like an hour, I know you're getting ready to start like your own podcast. And when we first talked about it, what have you decided to call it?
Atheist Stasis.
Atheist Stasis, which is something that you'll need to explain.
Yes.
But I loved the idea because one of the things we talked about was you are so passionate about, okay, let me make lists of the things that I don't know and understand and go see if I can find how to do this. And
right.
I was like, we should have a podcast that's just educating Jenna, and we can go find some expert on a subject to come in and just sit down and you get to ask whatever questions, because I think that by and large, we've done a terrible job with public education.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're actually any better on the average at getting people to understand things than we've ever been.
I agree.
And I don't think that we recognize that there are different people who learn in different ways. I was optimistic that the internet, and in particular YouTube, might fundamentally change that, where we might be addressing the different ways that people learn.
Oh, I think we are.
And I'm still optimistic about it because Beth broke a glass in the sink, and it broke my garbage disposal. And she went to work, And I went on YouTube and I Googled how to fix a broken garbage disposal. And the first video that pops up was this guy saying, most of the time, if you've got a broken garbage disposal, it's because somebody broke a glass and little bits of glass got in there. Here's what you do. And he goes down underneath the sink and he's like, you take this out, this out, this out, take it. And I'm following along and I grab the disposal, I take it out to the garage and I take the head off of it and I'm cleaning it all out and the bits of glass come out and I rinsed it all out. I went back and I installed it and turned it on and I felt like Tim Allen from Tool Time. I was like, rah, I'm a man's man. I fix a garbage disposal because this guy on YouTube knows what he's doing. But it's the reason that I do the atheist debate stuff. I've never claimed to be an expert in anything other than what I think, and maybe not even that. I've disagreed with everybody, including me, at some point or another. But I had to go about learning this stuff the hard way because despite the fact that I, was an intelligent person who had access to, a decent high school, albeit too many kids, I was bored in school. There was nothing that I was passionate about. There's nothing that got my attention. And then when I found the things I was passionate about, I had to teach myself how to learn.
Right.
And granted, I will acknowledge if there's anything I'm gifted at, it's that I can learn things fairly quickly and that I'm reasonably good at explaining them to other people in a way they can understand. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. But listening to you talk about, I didn't make lists of subjects. I wasn't like, I want to understand, particle physics better and this better and this better and this better. It was just, I think I'm a little too immediate for that because my thing is if I come across something and I'm like, I've never heard that before, I don't understand that well enough, I will drop everything else and then just go read and pore over it for hours.
Yeah.
And I don't do it with the intention of ever becoming an expert in anything. There's probably only 3 or 4 things that I have that I could be considered even remotely an expert in, and almost none of them have anything to do with religion or logic. I played semi-pro pool and I was an active gamer. There are things that I have some expertise in that don't fit that. Mm-hmm. But learning to learn, I really wish we did a better job of that. I get it. It's difficult. You got one teacher in a classroom with 20 to 40 students and all of them have different needs and you're in there for 45 minutes, but probably only 25 minutes of that is anything approaching instruction because, I don't know, maybe some people's classrooms run a little smoother.
I don't know. I didn't care about school when I was a kid. I mean, nothing really made sense. I mean, it didn't seem to apply to my life in any way. I had no interest because it had nothing to do with me. My life, I was going to be a mother and I was going to have kids and I was going to learn to... Or a nun, which, yeah. But you didn't have to learn anything to do that. They teach you there. So I was more about learning social skills and decorating and, stuff like that. I didn't care about science. I was like, that has nothing to do with me. And so at this point, that's how the big journey starts after the deconversion is because, like you said, I found out I didn't know so many things. And what I started doing was I looked it up. I had been fascinated with Einstein, and so I started doing research into his life and things that he did. And Psychology Today coined what he did. He did something called analytical meditation, where he would just allow his mind to just wander, and he'd look out a window and just kind of daydream, just kind of active daydreaming. And I started basically doing that, where I just allow my mind to go, that color, and what about colors and textures, and just kind of allow my mind to go wherever it wanted to. And it got me to thinking about free will and then other things, and it just kind of got me to open my brain in a way that I had never been able to do before. And so it blew my mind, and I got really passionate about that, and I started talking to people on the ACA private discussions group about like, oh my God, I discovered this thing, and maybe it's something that can help people, and some people were like, oh, you know what, chill. You're getting a little carried away. It's
funny that so the atheist community is, and granted, we have the atheist community of Austin, and we're probably largely doing a better job than ever of having a proper place. But the atheist community at large went from being very small, very white, very male, and generally over 50 to being everywhere with all sorts of different views and perspectives. And it's one thing that ends up happening is that you end up with these fights and schisms, and this group doesn't like that group, or somebody did something here, and so we're going to split off and form the other. And I've been watching this now for 15 years, and not once has it ever made me go, oh my gosh, everything's falling apart.
Right.
Every time I see it, it's, yes, there are bad things that happen, there are things that need to be addressed, but every time I see it, I just go, oh, this is growing pains. The movement is now big enough to be more than one tiny little, homogenous thing.
Yeah.
And it's okay for your group to be a skeptics in the pub group where we're going to meet on Thursdays and drink and talk shit about religion. Or, our group is going to be an activist group and we're going to go out and protest, church states violation laws. And this other one is, maybe we're not going to spend that much time talking about religion at all, but we're going to talk about humanism and critical thinking and things like that. I love the fact that there are enough groups for that. One of the things that's kind of been on the decline, though, is conventions. There was a period of time where there was a convention every other day and everybody was going to conventions and everybody was all excited. And while some conventions have maintained fairly good attendance, others have fallen off the map. And I think it was, it was like, oh, we're all going to all these conventions and people were excited. And then I think a lot of it dropped off when the political climate changed, because while atheists are not homogenous on politics either, there's no denying that the overwhelming majority of the broader atheist community is generally left-leaning. Not necessarily Democrats. There's Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Libertarians, Socialists, Anarchists, whatever. But it's more left-leaning. And when the politics shifted, I think people's focus shifted, and perhaps rightly so. When you look at something like Michael Newdow is constantly suing to get In God We Trust off the money, and while I would love to see that happen, it's not going to. And every time he does one of these lawsuits, he runs the risk of setting a bad precedent that we're never going to be able to return. And I no offense to Newdow, because at least he's doing something and trying to push forward on this. But right now, there are people who are far more concerned with individual rights and liberties and how we are marginalizing different groups of people more than whether or not you have a particular religion or religious freedom.
Yeah.
And I get that. But, I mean, for me, I'm going to stay focused on the Atheist Experience and the Atheist Debates Project. I've actually got a couple debates coming up in the next week or so. So August videos are going to be almost entirely debates and debate reviews.
Cool.
But I know you're getting ready to start your Atheist Stasis podcast stuff, and I'm sure at some point you'll be branching off from what we talked about here to the process after deconversion that led up to getting involved with the atheist community of Austin. Last question I had for today, and it's only because I see certain similarities. The first day that you did Atheist Experience, when you left, what was going through your head?
Oh my God, that was awesome. And that was way easier than I thought it was going to be. Now, so the thing is that, I don't know if you remember, but when you had asked me to be on the show, I was like, yeah, I'll need like a couple months to train, right? And you just kind of brushed over that. You're like, yeah, how about Sunday? And I was like, I guess. And I texted Mark, and I was like, Mark, do you think it's okay? Like, you know me well enough. Like, do you think that I'm qualified? And he's like, totally, do it.
No,
I was like, okay.
The first thing you expressed to me is you're like, I'm kind of new to all this, and I haven't dug in on the philosophy as much as you guys. And I remember just thinking, good. Because, like I was saying at the outset, we don't need 4 me's, we don't need 4 you's, but we need a me and a you. And one of the nice things is that you're going to come at this from a different perspective, and you're going to think of questions that nobody else does. But I'd already seen you on Nonprofits, and I was like, yes, we need to do that. The very first day that I ever did the Atheist Experience, and I talked about it a bit earlier, when Jeff didn't show up and I filled in, I left the show, did the after show dinner, and drove home. and my atheist roommate knew that I'd been going to the show, and I was just working in the booth behind there. And he was home, and instead of going to my room, I just went directly to his door, and I kind of stood there. And he's like, "Hey, Chief, what's up?" And I was like, "I just did the TV show." He's like, "Oh yeah? You mean you're like on the live show?" And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "What'd you think about that?" And I was like, "That's going to be my show in 6 months." And I didn't mean it. And by the way, I always have to correct this. It's not my show. It's the Atheist Community of Austin show. I just meant that this is what I can't stop doing, and I'm going to do everything I can to be the host of that show, because this is, I have to do this.
Yeah.
And so even a few weeks ago when things were rough and there were people who left and some people who were mad about things, and I was like, yeah, I got way too much on my plate, but I can't allow anything to happen to the organization or the show, because sure, I got my other things. I got the atheist debate stuff. I'm doing debates, but until I'm dead or they kick me off, the Atheist Experience is like one of the single most important things in my life.
Well, that's why I wanted to volunteer at the ACA specifically, was because it was important. It was necessary, because once I became an atheist, there was a freak out moment. I was lost. I didn't know what I was going to do. And then when I discovered through the YouTube algorithms, the AXP show, it started, you were talking about the flaws in these people's logic, and they were giving responses that I would have given, and I related, and I was like, this is really, really helpful. And that's why I wanted to volunteer at the ACA in any way I possibly could. And then as it turns out that the conversations that I'm having on air with you, you know, with the more education that you have as a background, it's so much easier than talking to my family. So I'm like, hey, I'll do this all day.
And the questions and stuff that you come up with, I know everybody else is already excited. It was the biggest reason I wanted to do this, and I know that we're now at like an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm not going to edit this down because I think everything that was discussed here is important. So thank you to all the people who made it all the way through this. You'll be seeing a lot more from Jenna at Atheist Stasis and on the show, and maybe we'll do some more discussions like this. But I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about not only a different path out of religion, but somebody who's looking at this with newer eyes, whereas I've been hosting for 15 years, or pretty close to that. And maybe that there's people who don't always connect with me because I have a Baptist background, which undeniably skews how I look at things. And so having more people with a Catholic background, maybe we can have some good Baptist, Catholic, or former Baptist, former Catholic fights.
That'd be fun.
Over doctrine, because we used to have to settle them on a softball field. And now we can do it wherever else. But thanks so much for coming over and doing this.
Thank you for having me.
I will get this posted probably later tonight or tomorrow. And as a reminder, there's an upcoming debate online with Jay Dyer, where I think he's going to be presenting the transcendental argument for the existence of God. And I would be pulling my hair out, but I can't really do that. But I'm hoping that we have a good discussion. More videos coming up next month. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.